You're skeptical of the state. You're getting over the myth of authority. But the state is still formidable. Or is it? You've got a front row seat in the transition to a free society. Let's dive headfirst into The White Pill Box with your host, Mark Maresca.
Greetings all. Thank you so much for joining today. Today I'd like to devote this episode to giving you a status on how I'm coming along with this project I've been working on, where I am trying to basically consolidate all of the insights of my Myth of Authority series. As you probably know, my Myth of Authority series is a 23-part podcast series, each episode being roughly in the 25 to 40 minute range, let's say about a half hour each. And at 23 episodes per, that comes out to roughly about 12, 13 hours of listening. If you decide to consume the entire series, you would be committing to about 12, 13 hours. Now, I do recommend listening to the entire series because all of the insights that we get from this series are all fleshed out and explained in detail, and it is the best way to consume it. However, I understand the fact that it's a lot, and I think, and I agree that there is a need for it to be consolidated. So I've thought of several ways that it could possibly be done to be consolidated. The best way I've found so far, and I'm open to any suggestions you guys might have if you feel this is off track, if there's a better way to do it, I'm very open to that. But right now, the way I'm going to attack it is through a graphical presentation. The best way so far that I found to do it is with PowerPoint. Now, very quickly, I want to get ahead of any concerns you might have. It's not going to be a simple slideshow that you kind of go through like some kind of business presentation. I'm using the tool to create a presentation, but I am making it dynamic. And in that sense, what I mean is right from the very first slide you see, there will be internal links that will permit the viewer to click and move wherever they want based on wherever their own mind and curiosity takes them, based on what the slide is presenting. And so they'll see a slide, they will move on to wherever they want based on the links offered. And from there, once again, move on. So there'll be quite a number of slides. At this point, it's already reaching about 50. And there probably will be more than that. But it doesn't mean this will be a tedious or difficult presentation. The whole point of it is to really just serve up some consolidated insights, consolidated graphics that get right into your head right away because they're pictorial with text, of course, explanatory text. And then from there, allow the viewers' curiosity to simply take them wherever they want to go. This way, if they're interested in really just an overview kind of a thing, they will look at the slides that look like that. If they want more detail, they can drill down and see more detail. So what I'm going to do is sort of give you a preview of where things are right now with respect to just a few of the slides. Okay, the particular slide series, which will be 3 of them that I'm going to show you, have to do with what I call the toxic codependency between the myth of authority and the state. Now, this can get into a whole explanation of why it's like that, and I will link to the episodes from the Myth of Authority series that go into this. But essentially, it's the fact that the myth of authority in the heads of the majority is the root cause of the state itself. It's why the state exists, and it's why the state persists. The state itself feeds into the myth by means of propaganda. If the state didn't have propaganda to further reinforce the myth, eventually the myth would fade over time. Now, that too is something that kind of leads into a whole discussion. I'm not going to get into that today, but I wanted to show you the graphic that I'm using to illustrate this, and here it is. So again, this is one slide of many, many slides. This one in particular is titled, Why the State Persists, a Toxic Codependency. Now, incidentally, this is an animated slide. Right now, I've frozen it for you so that I could kind of explain how I arrived at this sort of style. But because it's a toxic codependency between, let's see, I'm going to point here. I think you can see my pointer. The myth of authority, the state, and propaganda. All right, so this gives you a feel for what the slide itself looks like, but let me give you some other navigation, some of my navigation plans here. whenever any object like this, the state, this little box here, is encircled by the orange border, which is true of all these here, as you can see, these will be clickable, which means you click them and you will link to yet another slide. Down here at the bottom left, you'll see the same similar text box, which is embroidered with orange, and it says definitions, and every slide will have that, so you can always flip over to a definitions slide and read actual verbal definitions. And beyond that, there's just going to be graphics and other animations here and there that will help to deliver the point that I'm trying to make on that particular slide. So this particular one, why this state persists, a toxic codependency. I'm now going to start the animation on this, and you're going to see a little graphic that moves between these three parts to help explain it. So here we go. The toxic codependency starts with the first, which is the myth of authority is the essential factor that sustains the state. So that just, I hope, helps to reinforce that link. The next one is from the state to propaganda. The state wants you to desperately need it. Best way to do that, propaganda. And then finally, propaganda reinforces the myth of authority. Now, this would just continue this way until you refresh this slide. But I'm going to keep it on here for a while just so you can get a feel for what the user will see if they're just sort of taking in the slide. The myth of authority up the upper left is the essential factor that sustains the state. The state wants you to desperately need it. Best way to do that, propaganda. Propaganda reinforces the myth of authority, and so we go. So this is what I consider to be an important insight. I never really expressed this particular kind of circular codependency in this level of detail, even in the Myth of Authority series. So I think this is a good graphic that conveys it. Here on the bottom right corner are three different questions that I think logically pertain to this, that someone might ask if they are looking at this graphic and sort of getting the point. They might ask, for example, is this pattern inevitable? Meaning, if you have the myth of authority, does it always create the state? If you have the state, does it always want to desperately use propaganda to continue existing? If you have propaganda, does it always reinforce the myth of authority? And that's thus the question, is this pattern inevitable? Another question they might ask is, why is the myth so powerful? They might also ask, what happens if the myth is eroding? And there could be other questions that I think they may ask, but these were the first three that came to mind. And because they're bordered in orange, it will mean that each one will be clickable, taking it to another slide. And that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to click this particular one, is this pattern inevitable? This is the slide which asks, is this pattern inevitable? Once again, here I've frozen the slide. The user will not see a frozen slide. It will immediately start its animation. But I wanted to freeze it so that I can explain once again what I'm doing here. So is this pattern inevitable? Now the question will be, is it inevitable for the myth of authority to create the state? Is it inevitable that the state uses propaganda? Is it inevitable that propaganda once again reinforces the myth of authority? So now I'm going to let the animation go. This is what the user would see immediately. And the answer to the first one pops in as yes, myth to state is psychologically inevitable. As far as the state, yes, the state is always incentivized to push propaganda. Propaganda, no. Propaganda reinforcing the myth isn't a slam dunk. So I'm sure you'll find that an interesting graphic. And also, if you are libertarian anarchist, if you're already red-pilled, you yourself probably are not convinced. You probably think propaganda always reinforces the myth of authority. After all, we've seen that forever. So why would I be saying no, propaganda reinforcing the myth isn't a slam dunk? Well, I haven't done that slide yet, so this is not clickable just yet. But this gives you an idea of where this would go. And I hope that it would consolidate for the already red-pilled the basic principle, because a lot of these they're going to agree with already and don't need, let's say, to listen to an entire episode that explains it. But something like this, the propaganda not reinforcing the myth necessarily, that might be something that a fellow traveler might think, and they might be curious about that. And clicking that will get them right to the slide that explains it. And so once again, if you contrast that with listening to the Myth of Authority series of podcasts, they would not have to figure out which episode to go to for that. This simply takes them there by link. And then let me give you one that I have done, a link that I have done, namely the state. I think you'll find this interesting. So if we click here on the state, this is going to flesh out a definition of the state graphically. And here we have that next slide, the state. It's two components. One, the bullies, a really small group of power seekers who have everything to do with the myth. And the second component of the state is their vast resources, which have nothing to do with the myth. And in the vast resources, there are little thumbnails that expand out to the components of the state, and what you might think of as the assets or functional attributes of the state: money, land, roads and structures, guns and tanks, natural resources, equipment, and clerks. Now, some of you may already think, why are clerks included here in resources? Why are they not bullies? Well, that's a good question. And if you've listened to the Myth of Authority series, you would understand that distinction. This graphic, however, allows us to see the distinction clearly by simply clicking on clerks or clicking on the bullies, and we'll get a sense of that relationship. And also these side text boxes are supplements to the two resources. So in the first case, the bullies, it says here they have everything to do with the myth. So clicking on the myth, because that's embroidered in orange, would get you to an explanation of the Myth of Authority itself. The vast resources have nothing to do with the myth. So you don't believe in the state because they have a lot of natural resources or a lot of money or a lot of guns. You don't believe in their legitimate authority because of that. And the clerks, incidentally, are part of the overall assets. You don't believe in the Myth of Authority because a clerk in the DMV office told you to do something. You know you have to obey, but you're not believing in their moral legitimacy. But that's very different for the bullies of the state. Who are the real power seekers? Those would be the politicians, law enforcement, military. And those are the parties who are really the subjects of the Myth of Authority. And in this final link up here, the bullies, that would expand out to actually show what the bullies are comprised of. Again, if you've listened to the series, you would know the answer to this. But again, if you're coming in fresh, it will help to simply click it and see the expansion on it. And you'll notice that I used an hourglass or a spyglass, as some people call it, and other slides would also reinforce that point, that the state is actually quite small. So as you can see, the point of that was to kind of give you a feel for how this show would present itself. I still have to work out how I would actually make that available, whether it would be on a website or whether it would be a downloadable slideshow type of file. I want to make it as easy as possible for it to be consumed, but whatever the presentation is, it has to maintain those animations and the internal navigation links. One thing I learned was that if I simply convert that show to a PDF, which you can do, the resulting PDF will not necessarily maintain the links and some of the graphics, in fact. So it probably has to stay as a PowerPoint show, and that's fine. But still, I would need to make that file available somehow. It can be put onto a website, but then I would probably have to abandon the whole tool itself of PowerPoint and really have it be done in technical web creation type of tools. And I don't want to go that distance right now if I can make this simple, because the whole point of this is to keep it simple, but also keep it navigatable, keep it intact, and also get this done in a reasonable amount of time. Now, the other topic I wanted to cover here was related but unrelated. It's the concept of the white pill itself. Now, with some of the feedback I'm getting, some of the comments, some of the communications I've gotten from some of the subscribers, some of the listeners, especially the ones who are fairly new, when they sort of conceptualize white pill, they are making what I think is probably a natural assumption, and that is you must be a really positive guy, and it's great that you have a great outlook on life. Good for you. And I think it kind of stops there. That's not how I see my presentation and my content. I see it as the white pill in the sense of genuine, realistic hope that we will be seeing a stateless society someday. Realistic is the entire basis of that. What I feel I'm doing is understand the psychology of it. And if in studying it, I find that there are real world, realistic reasons to have hope, that's what I want to offer as a white pill. And that has actually happened in all this process. So this really doesn't have anything to do with me making up reasons to feel good, sort of like a life coach would do, or some kind of motivational speaker. That's really not at all what this is about. It's about finding the real world reasons to have hope. So I want to make sure that even in this presentation that I'm going to create, and in my continued content, that the hope is that, especially for the red pill, the already red pilled, if they understand that's the point of the white pills here, then when they hear me say something that they might consider controversial or they're skeptical about, that's fine. I want them to be skeptical. But I want them to go further and think, okay, this guy's white pills are based on reality and the real world. I want them to get curious and say, I want to find out what those real world reasons are, because I want to feel white pilled for the right reasons, for realistic reasons. So a good example of that, I think, would be my contention that we have already started the transition to a free society. Now, one way I want to illustrate that is by bringing up the graphic show once again. Okay, once again, you'll see this toxic codependency. And I want to use this as an illustration. I don't think there's any argument among us anarchist voluntarists that the myth of authority does lead to the state. And if there's any doubt of that, that's so easily provable. And that also will come out in this graphic show. Also, the state has to use propaganda. That will also be fleshed out, but I don't think there's too much doubt about that. The state has to have its propaganda. Propaganda reinforcing the myth of authority. Now the question is this inevitable? My plan, of course, is to create a link to that very box there, the one that says no, it isn't a slam dunk, and allow the viewer to see it graphically and perhaps in an animated way as this cyclical, continuing, self-reinforcing circle. We still have a state doing decent propaganda. We have a culture that propagandizes for the state. Clearly that reinforces the myth of authority, and of course the myth of authority continues to sustain the state. So we have this circle happening even today. The point I want to make when I make the case for us being in the transition to a free society is to sort of take this picture and then imagine some kind of disruption to it. I thought of, as an example, an asteroid strike from outer space hitting the Earth as sort of an unexpected event. Well, I want to sort of use that or some similar type of metaphor that shows this continuing solid cycle, but something coming in from the outside and disrupting it, and in particular hitting it right here at this vulnerable point where I say that it isn't necessarily a slam dunk. Now, the reason I consider it a vulnerable point is because it's distinctive from the other two in an important way. The myth of authority leading to the state is psychologically necessary. In other words, if you have a myth of authority in the heads of the vast majority of people, then pretty much inevitably, psychologically, it's going to lead to the state. Now, again, that's explained in more detail, but the important point is that it's a psychological inevitability. It's going to happen. It's going to happen so long as humans are human. The state desperately needing to propagandize as a means to sustain itself is also psychologically inevitable. The state are power seekers who want to maintain their power. Well, they can't do that if they don't propagandize. Now, that may need some explanation, and it will be explained in its own slide. But the point is, if the state did not propagandize, then the myth of authority would eventually weaken. However, propaganda successfully reinforcing the myth, it's not inevitable that propaganda works. It has worked quite well, and that's why we may tend to think that it is inevitable. But we also know that it doesn't succeed. And we are living proof of that. Any anarchist knows that even though we hear every single day more propaganda in our ears, we don't buy it anymore. That right there is proof that it's not inevitable. Now, by that, I'm not trying to imply that the only way for us to get to a stateless society is for most of the world to become anarchist, or even a high percentage. What I am saying, though, is that propaganda itself does not inevitably lead to the myth of authority in the minds of individual people. And if it can happen in the minds of individual people, it means that clearer thinking or skepticism is a possibility in people's minds. So this cycle can be disruptive. That propaganda would not be as successful in reinforcing the myth of authority. Now, the question, of course, would be, what would be that disruption? And I would then, from there, link to another slide that would explain that. And in particular, it would be technology. Technology comes in as sort of what you might think of as an unexpected factor in all this. And it would be unexpected because historically there wasn't any kind of technology that could have impacted the efficacy of propaganda. But that is in fact what happened when the internet came along. We had, for the very first time that I know in human history, an element that could actually change the dynamic of propaganda. Now, propaganda always existed in some form or another. It may not have been as sophisticated in the past, but there was always some kind of propaganda that those in power were able to leverage so that the minds of the people were clouded enough not to see them as illegitimate and instead to believe that they needed them and thereby to have the myth of authority. So, for example, superstition, religion, factors like that cause people to have less critical thinking than they might otherwise have. And because through most of history people were busy simply surviving, whereas those in power, because they are parasitical, were able to not only survive, but to live better, and thereby having an incentive to continue whatever particular myths, superstitions, religions reinforced their propaganda. We can look at it as the monopolization of information flow. If the ruling elite had more or less a monopolization on information flow, they could determine what information arrived into the minds of the general public, the ruling class acting as gatekeepers of what the public is permitted to hear. So that is the asteroid strike, so to speak. Technology has come in and changed that to where now we have essentially a decentralized information flow. The creators of content today can now be literally almost any individual human being on the planet putting out some kind of content. It could be a Facebook post, it could be a YouTube video, just like this one, a Substack post, just like this one. That's an individual person putting out content, and that can go into the minds of literally any individual person. That's true decentralization. The world has seen nothing like that in all of history. That's, to me, comparable to an asteroid strike. Right to that part of that cycle of codependency, that toxic codependency that strikes at the propaganda part of it. So what that means is that the state is less able to successfully propagandize. The propagandized content that the state wants the public to hear is diluted. It's competing with all the other content that now it's possible for them to consume and that they do in fact consume every single day. So you have the public getting a smaller percentage of propaganda put into their minds. That's the world we live in today. Now, I would say that realistically, that's only really become a tangible factor in the last 10 years at the very most. Because prior to that, the CNNs and the Foxes and all the other handmaidens of the state still had enough of a monopolization of what we heard because people were still consuming a lot of their news through those outlets. Now, of course, that's not all there is to consumption of media. There's also just videos that entertain you and that you learn from. But all of that itself is also expanding and competing for people's time. And I would say in the last 7 years, is when it's really ramped up. And because of that now, we are starting to see the increase in skepticism among, I would say, the general public. So there's that element from propaganda to the myth that is being undermined now. It's not a slam dunk that propaganda is going to always successfully reinforce the myth of authority. Now, of course, there's way more to all this. There's a lot more detailed on-the-ground type of evidence. That was all covered in the Myth of Authority series. But based on what I'm doing here, this consolidated graphic show, I want to convey those ideas in a quicker, more rapid-fire, more dynamic and interactive way. And so propaganda, now having a more difficult time of it, is just one example of that. So I think that was about it for what I wanted to cover today. I hope you enjoyed it. I definitely want your feedback. I'd love your feedback on how the graphics are looking. If you have suggestions, whether they're technical suggestions or visual suggestions or any others, I'm very open because this is really the early stage of this project. I'm very willing to take any suggestions you have and improve upon it. But I think we'll wrap it up for today. Thank you so much for joining. Take care and see you next time.
Thanks so much to all subscribers and everyone who joined today. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.